Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Fadi Kafiti and I'm the Assistant Director of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston. On behalf of Dr. Takriti and the center, I'm going to give the introduction today. Today's symposium on Arab Marxism and national liberation is co-sponsored by the Middle East Institute at Columbia University and the Mahdi Amel Cultural Center in Lebanon. I would also, in addition to thanking all the panelists today and the audience, I would like to express special thanks to Rada Hamdan, Brinkley Messick, Astrid Benedek, Sebastian Butchin, and Carol Eichels for all their help in organizing and arranging this event. We at the AAEF Center for Arab Studies are on strike today in solidarity with the general strike taking place in Palestine. We ultimately decided to proceed with this event because strikes have a rich history of teach-ins and educational programs in support of what's happening on the ground. Of course, we did our own teach-in on Palestine on Sunday. Since Mahdi Amel has extensively reflected on Palestine and was deeply committed to the Palestinian liberation through the Lebanese Communist Party's alliances with the Palestinian Revolution, we feel that a discussion of his thoughts would fall into this category today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator of the event, Dr. Mayssoun Sukarieh, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of International Development at King's College London and is also on strike with us today. Dr. Sukarieh, the floor is yours. Thank you.
National liberation, solidarity with the Palestinian people, and condemn the brutality of the settler colonial state of Israel, and for the refugees to Palestine. As we know, liberation struggles, as we know, need all kinds of resources to succeed. One of which is having powerful conceptual framework to guide arguments as analysis, as well as imagination. While there are many such useful frameworks in the Arab world, one framework that is vital to the tradition is a tradition of Marxism in this part of the world.
Apologies, everyone. This is obviously a feature of the crazy Zoom world we live in at the moment. Dr. Messick, do you want to say a word on behalf of the Columbia Center of Welcome to People, given the fact that you're co-sponsoring?
I just wanted to say thank you to the energies and organizing spirit of the center here at Houston, and the Middle East Institute at Columbia is very happy to participate and co-sponsor. And we have one of your key figures is a Columbia person, Angela Giordani, who's right here, and who was a translator, and whose dissertation committee I was on, and I've heard her brilliance up close. So we're very happy. Thank you very much for doing this initiative.
Thank you, Dr. Messick. Okay, so let's start actually, and then as soon as Dr. Sukarieh logs in, she'll be able to contribute her statement and so on. I think part of what she was trying to allude to was that the current situation in Palestine is unbearable. But also part of the way to confront these colonial situations is to think about how systems of oppression operate. And Mahdi Amel was trying to theorize how these systems of oppression operate both at the economic and the political and the social levels. So it is a great pleasure to be hosting you here today with us. And we're going to start, of course, with a discussion by the contributors to the volume themselves. And then we're going to have reflections by Professor McNally and myself. Professor McNally will look into the impact of the work of Mahdi Amel and its connection to broader Marxist theories, and I'm going to talk about its location within theories of liberation in the Arab world.
Pleasure. It's an honor and a pleasure to be introducing Dr. Hicham Safieddine today to open our symposium. Dr. Hicham Safieddine holds a PhD in Middle East Studies from the University of Toronto and an MA in Political Science from York University, Canada. Hicham's current research explores the history of financial colonization including the creation of central banks across the global south with a particular emphasis on Arab societies and states. He's also researching the history of Arab economic thought in the post-World War II period and its relationship to contemporaneous notions of modernization and development. His first book, Banking on the State, The Financial Foundations of Lebanon, was published by Stanford University Press in 2019. In addition to his academic research and teaching, Hisham's the co-founder of eZines, Al-Akhbar English, and the Legal Agenda's English editions. In addition, his public writings have appeared in the Toronto Star, Al Jazeera English, the Monthly Review, Le Monde Diplomatique, Al-Adab, the Middle East Eye, Egypt Independent, Asafir, Jadali, and Al-Ahram Weekly. Dr. Hicham is also the editor of Arab Marxism and National Liberation, Select Writings of Mahdi Amel. Please, Dr. Hicham, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fadi, for the welcome, and thank you, Mayssoun in absentia, for your introduction, and we look forward to having you back with us. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, wherever you are. I am truly honored to be speaking today as part of a series of successful seminars organized by the Center for Arab Studies. Thanks to community support via the Arab American Educational Foundation and the intellectual vision and moral leadership of the center's director, my dear friend and brother, Dr. Abdel Razzaq Takriti, the center is fast becoming a leading and much needed space of researching, teaching, and learning about the Arab region. And I believe it's a model to be emulated in terms of its financial independence and in terms of its mission and mandate. I'm equally delighted to have the event co-sponsored by Columbia University's Middle East Institute. Thank you, Professor Brinkley, for a very prompt acceptance of our invitation, and by the Beirut-based Mahdi Amel Cultural Center, with special thanks to Mahdi Amel's wife, the late Evelyn Hamdan, and his son, Rida Hamdan, present, I believe, with us today. Rida, if you're here, hello. I'm thankful to them for their persistence in preserving and promoting the thought of Mahdi Amel and making this volume possible. I also want to thank the Dandashli family for financing this translation. And I'm very happy to have also Dr. Angela Giordani with us today to speak about the book. Having Professor David McNally as a lead discussant is a special honor too. I actually learned the ABCs of Marxist Capital from David in class, and he taught it like no one else does, a page-by-page meticulous dissection of the book itself, like a skilled surgeon in a class of anatomy, dismembering the parts to understand the whole while keeping the whole intact, which is not an easy task. And last but not least, I want to thank Fadi Kafiti, the assistant director, for his wonderful hands-on assistance in preparing for the event. I'm going to begin my remarks today, and I will speak about Palestine in the Q&A about today, that is what's happening. I will begin my remarks with the defiant motto that was uttered by Amel during the Israeli siege and bombardment of Beirut in 1982. Back then he said, "Lasta mahzuman ma dumta tuqawim." You are not defeated as long as you resist. The words ring true today as we witness another wave of heroic Palestinian resistance in all its glorious forms against a depraved and brutal Israeli violence in all its gory forms. The quote is both universal. Any resistance is a negation of defeat. So whatever you're resisting, whoever you are, as long as you resist in your daily life for a cause, it's a negation, it's a universal concept. And also it's particular when Amel uttered it at the same time. Palestinian and Arab resistance is a negation of defeat against Israeli aggression. This interplay between the universal and the particular is a key principle underlying Amel's life and work, including his most important project to theorize Marxism from a colonial perspective. And the major hypothesis, and he also says it's a hypothesis for those who question the validity of it, or conceptual framework of a colonial mode of production. I'm not going to be able to give Amel's legacy its due in the little time I have. Instead, I'm going to make brief remarks under 3 headlines, and I'm happy to discuss any of them or all of them during the Q&A. The first is a little bit about the book and what I hope its contribution will be and what is the motivation behind it. The second is about Amel's main theoretical contribution in areas of intervention. And the third theme is, how do we read Amel today? So how do we think of his legacy and relevance for the present and for the future struggle and scholarship? So let me say a few words about the motivation and the mandate. When I took this project on, I believed in bringing to light the intellectual contribution of a prominent Arab Marxist, so he may reclaim his rightful place in the 20th century canon of political thought. I also recognize the epistemological significance of translating theory from Arabic to English rather than vice versa. Intellectual influence and consequently translation must not be unidirectional. It should not only be from English to Arabic. And the works like Amel defy persistent stereotypes that Arab intellectual production is derivative, which is a common theme sometimes, particularly in Western liberal thought. It is my hope that this translation will create an incentive for a broader effort at translating Arabic thought writ large to English. Now, on the second point of Amel's intellectual contribution, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, and hopefully we'll nitpick on these things later on. So Amel was born in 1936 and he was assassinated in 1987. And through this life of his, he was a prolific writer. In addition to his theorization of the colonial relation, which I referred to, he wrote on a range of subjects. He tried to apply class analysis to sectarianism, political Islam, Orientalism, culture and revolution, and the relationship of cultural heritage to modernity. Throughout his writings, he tried to produce a theory of Marxism that took colonial rather than Western capitalist social reality as the objective basis of his analysis. In other words, he tried to explain underdevelopment according to colonial reality's own terms. There is theoretical and historical significance to this. Historically, in my view, his work reminds us that Marxism was a major current of political action and intellectual activity in the Arab world. By reviving his thought, we are actually better understanding the mid-20th century historical conjuncture of national liberation in Arab history. And unfortunately today, this conjuncture of the mid-20th century Arab socialism, if you will, is often dismissed as a passing moment of progressive reformation or derided as a failed project of modernization. That's the historical bit. Theoretically, Amel's Marxism undermines persistent post-colonial polemics that reduce Marxism to a provincial theory of mere European relevance. His Marxism is equally a challenge to Marxist dogma that is steeped in Western thought. And I would add, his theory of colonial mode of production overlaps with dependency theory, but departs from it in productive and creative ways. By looking at his work, we will enrich, not undermine, anti-colonial approaches to Marxism. Some of these concepts or contradictions, to give you an idea of the richness of them, and I'm just going to throw them in, without actually defining them or explaining them. The colonial relation, the colonial mode of production, characteristics of the colonial mode of production, like class substitution versus class revolution, the renewed colonial bourgeoisie, class indifferentiation, and even class unification that he talks about under colonialism, the national versus nationalist struggle, settler proletariat, sectarian hegemony, the bourgeois sectarian state and its deadlocked contradiction, nihilist versus obscurantist everyday thought, Islamized bourgeois thought, the contradiction of a temporal versus institutional Islam, the staging of history, and the diachronous characteristics of multiple modes of production in a colonial society, which he would argue, I think, is a much more complex set of contradictions than Western thought. A very different approach to the linear understanding of a primitive or a very preformed modern world that is trying to catch up with the West. And this brings me to the third theme about reading Amel today. Since the Arab uprisings, as Mayssoun actually spoke about early on, there's been a revival of interest in Amel among a new generation of leftists, and that's wonderful. There are murals celebrating his legacy. We see references on social media to his quotes, which also has triggered an interest in the Anglophone world about his work. But much of this interest, I would argue, as significant as it is, remains highly symbolic. Amel's in-depth arguments were lost in the heat of the political moment or have remained unattainable due to the language barrier, which I hope this book will break in some respect. More sinister still, Amel's assassination, unfortunately, is being instrumentalized today to score cheap political points, namely to discredit political forces, Islamist forces, in a decontextual or ahistorical manner, or to validate other assassinations that have of figures that have nothing to do or little to do in common with Amel politically or intellectually, which is an anti-Marxist move that flattens political violence. And Amel, I would argue, was always opposed to depoliticizing violence. These, in my view, are impoverished readings of Amel at best. In response, I say, do not provincialize Amel or turn him into a fetish of petty politics or performative resistance. Amel's work is in conversation with Marx, Lenin, Gramsci, Fanon, Jack Burke, Charles Bettelheim, Samir Amin, Edward Said, Adonis, Ilyas Khouri, Fawaz Trabulsi, and I would add Ranjit Guha and Ali Razavi. So I would say, let us debate him unapologetically, but on these terms. Lastly, in terms of reading him today, non-European Marxist thought like Amel's is a reminder of the need to renew Marxist thought based on the concrete and particular social realities of today and the demands of existing political struggles. So it's not enough to repeat, whatever dependency theory did in the 20th century, let's find tools to renovate it, to renew it, to renew Marxism the same way Amel tried to do so in his own time and age. Amel emphasized the unified nature of political struggle. For him, transformative rather than speculative theoretical activity, including the production of a theory of underdevelopment, was part and parcel of his political struggle. And the beginnings of Amel's struggle bring us back to Palestine. Amel's first major influence was his high school teacher and Palestinian educator, Shafiq al-Hout, who later became a prominent member of the PLO. Hout introduced Amel to Marxism. Both teacher and student discussed national liberation in Algeria and Palestine, inside and outside the classroom. Both struggles, that of Algeria and of Palestine, were seen as part of a global struggle for universal emancipation from capitalism and colonialism, and the construction of a new and brave world of socialism. Al-Hout and Amel devoted the entirety of their life to their cause. That was, to borrow from Frantz Fanon, how they discovered their generation's mission and emerged out of relative obscurity. Whatever the outcome, they fulfilled this mission. Let us hope we don't betray ours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hicham. Now we'll move on to Dr. Angela Giordani. Dr. Angela Giordani holds a PhD in history with a certificate in comparative literature and society from Columbia University. She specializes in the intellectual and cultural history of the modern Arab world with a focus on 20th century Arabic language philosophy, legal theory, and historiography. Prior to Columbia, she studied Arabic and Islamic studies at the University of Texas at Austin and the Universities of Damascus and Alexandria. Angela is currently writing a book entitled Scions of Ibn Sina, Arab Humanists and Islamic Philosophy in the 20th Century. Based on her dissertation, this monograph traces the modern reconstruction of classical Arabo-Islamic philosophy through the efforts of an influential circle of Egyptian scholars to reimagine and remake the tradition for modern thought and education. Angela's research has been supported by the Consortium for Intellectual Cultural History, the Social Science Research Council, the Doris G. Quinn Foundation. For the 2021-22 academic year, she'll be a resident research fellow at the Yale Law School's Abdullah S. Kamel Center for Study of Islamic Law and Civilization. While the Mahdi Amel volume is by far her most extended translation project yet, she's also published translations for Jadaliyya, the MLA's Arab Renaissance Anthology, and the Legal Agenda. Dr. Angela, please, the floor is yours.
I just want to thank everybody for attending and for this wonderful symposium. It's refreshing in these days of isolation, intellectual isolation especially, and in the horrors we're seeing right now in Palestine. Maybe we'll talk about it a little bit in the Q&A, but this project was a very special one to me that I, for better or for worse, did in parallel with writing my dissertation. I'll get to that in a little while. But yeah, it was a wonderful project to work with Hicham, and I'm honored to work with this text. And so my presentation is going to kind of dive a little deeper into the text, because this is what I really spent years with. So I'm sure many of you have read Mahdi Amel in Arabic prior to reading our volume, if you've gotten a chance to look at it. And I suspect that those of you who have read him won't be surprised if I were to say that the translation-related issues discussed in the 2-page translator's note were just the tip of an iceberg of translation issues that we confronted in translating the texts included in our volume. In the small space of our translator's note, we flag 2 issues. The first is the challenge posed by Amel's idiosyncratic style, which we very politely describe as dense but concise and consciously didactic, with the assumption that the reader will get what we mean by this when she actually starts reading the texts. The second issue on which we spend more time in the note is how we chose to render Amel's similarly idiosyncratic concepts, some of which have correlates but not equivalents in Western theoretical vocabularies, whether Marxism, Leninism, or world systems and dependency theory. The exemplary concept of this kind that we foreground in our note is bourgeoisie al-Istimaria, which we translated as colonialist bourgeoisie over the more common metropolitan bourgeoisie. This decision was not based solely on, as we note in the translator's note, the fact that Amel uses metropolia elsewhere in his writing, but not here. Rather, it can be said to reflect an attempt on our part to preserve the structural link and differentiation that Amel asserts between this bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie al-Istimaria of the metropole, and what he theorizes as its parasitic representative in the colonies, al-bourgeoisie al-colonialia, which in Amel's scheme is, of course, a pseudo-class of sorts, in that it lacks an independent class existence of its own due to its formation under the aegis of colonial dependency. Our flagging of terms like this in the translator's note is meant to give readers who are unfamiliar with Amel's work a sense of how he really does develop a unique and rigorous Arabic Marxist lexicon. The development of such a lexicon is, of course, central to what he calls the necessary work of Marxist theory, work that he states must take our, quote, our preformed Marxist thought as an object of inquiry. It is indeed a tenet of Amel's thinking that we cannot take concepts, Marxist or otherwise, as fixed analytics equipped to be applied in analyzing, quote, our colonial reality. To do so would, in his estimation, amount to a, quote, a violent insertion of this reality into the fixed molds of our preformed thought that fails to register what is new in this reality. It's the newness of the reality that in turn mandates the development of new concepts capable of comprehending it. This again, for Amel, does not mean departing from Marxist thought, but to the contrary, quote, submitting it to Marxist principles, of which he insists fearless self-critique is paramount. And I would wager that it's the like rigorous reflexivity, which Amel deems constitutive of, quote, sound Marxist thought, that makes reading him such a unique and uniquely intense experience. With this, I want to come back to the question of translating his style and the challenges that this posed. How to render Amel's style in a way that preserves or recreates the experience of reading him in Arabic while at the same time making the language digestible to English readers was a constant battle for me and Hicham. Like any worthwhile task, I guess, this was a task that was sometimes really interesting and exhilarating and other times like tedious and breakdown inducing. There were several afternoons where, actually remember this one paragraph, it's 5 pages long in the original, it's chapter 4 in the colonial mode of production. And we ultimately decided to break up the paragraph, but it was like day 3 of translating the paragraph and I couldn't take it anymore. So I went to the gym to clear my mind, but instead I sat down in the gym cafe and got out my laptop and kind of frantically messaged Hicham to ask him to read what I was working on and tell me what it was saying, because I got to a point where I felt like I'd read and translated an idea 100 times, but suddenly didn't understand it. Those of you who have read Amel likely have had similar experiences. There are sentences one comes across that seem to be saying the same thing a dozen different ways, but adding a nuance that makes you feel as though you've somehow grasped and misunderstood the same idea a dozen different ways. I'll maybe get to some examples of this and return to the challenge that the challenge and really the possibility that this kind of style poses to translation. And what I hope to convey along the way is how this famously or perhaps infamously difficult style in Amel's writings, in fact, reflects a remarkably deliberate and self-conscious approach to theory that is very deserving of our attention, both as practitioners and teachers of theory. So in the few minutes I have, I want to briefly discuss what Amel has to say about his particular Marxist approach with reference to how his methodological commitments are actualized through his particular writing style. The sections of our volume, if you're curious and kind of reading where he states these methodological commitments most clearly, are in chapters 3 and 6, which reproduce first the introduction to Amel's theoretical prolegomena or Muqaddimat Nazariya and his critique of Edward Said. I've already been quoting some from the Muqaddimat Nazariya, which embodies Amel's attempt to differentiate his approach to Marxist analysis from existing paradigms. What makes for what he deems sound Marxist thinking is that it is anchored in, quote, our reality in its own process of formation, rather than in, quote, Marxism as a preformed system of thought that we attempt to apply to our reality. Like the reality of which it produces scientific knowledge, then Marxist thinking, according to Amel, is itself a process or haraka, a movement of thought and formation. This haraka question is one I'll get to in a second, but basically for Amel to reconceptualize the work of Marxist theory in this way amounts to a methodological revolution or thawra manhajiyya, where method or manhaj is structured not by agreed upon established truths or a certain formal process of reasoning. Rather, method in Amel's sense can only be defined in very open terms as, I'm going to say the Arabic first, كيفية حركة الفكر في اعتباره الواقع موضوعا له, which we rendered as the modality by which the thought process takes reality as its subject. This was very difficult to translate, and I feel that there's something missed in the idiomatic kind of thought process phrase that we use to render harakat al-fikr. We did so, though, because, of course, thought movement or intellectual movement invokes something different in English and could confuse matters even more. In any case, I'm bringing attention to this particular line because I really think it conveys, in terms that don't seamlessly translate, the dynamic sort of theoretical apparatus that Amel works to produce in the name of Marxism. He sums up his Marxist method in one of his signature algorithmic distillations as an approach that moves, quote, from reality to thought in a critique of preformed thought that is a process of building thought in formation. In Arabic, من الواقع للفكر في حركة نقد للفكر المتكون هي بناء للفكر الذي يتكون. As with the movement of history itself, then, of reality and formation, this movement of thought is determined by contradictions. Readers of the selections that we decided to include in our volume will notice that each chapter kind of promptly recasts this topic, whether it's sectarianism, underdevelopment, or the heritage debate, as the site or outcome of a contradiction. Amel's discussion of sectarianism in modern Lebanon begins, for example, by explaining how sectarianism emerged and is constantly produced as the relation of contradiction between, on the one hand, the ruling bourgeoisie and the imperialist sectarian system through which it established and reproduces its class dominance, and on the other hand, the laboring classes that submit to and oppose this system. So this is, of course, this is a pretty classic, I think, Marxist-Leninist move in that it recasts what's generally taken to be a kind of timeless religion or identitarian issue as instead a class conflict rooted in the historical formation of new capitalist relations under the aegis of imperialism. But Ahmed does not execute this move classically. The argument is not delivered in the form of a straightforward kind of I argue thesis followed by neatly organized points, this kind of form that we demand of our students and that academic journals demand of us. to theorize this way, in this kind of programmatic way, would arguably be to take as givens the validity both of sectarianism as an object of analysis and of class analysis as a framework for thinking it. And as we've already seen, this is precisely what Amel promises he will not do in Muqaddimat Nazariya, where he insists upon the exigency of critically interrogating the categories and analytical tools of preformed thought. So in the spirit, he begins the section on sectarianism, the excerpt we included from On the Sectarian State, not with an argument, but by posing and addressing the question of whether, quote, the specific conceptual and theoretical tools of materialist thought are in fact capable of producing concrete knowledge of a concrete situation known in Lebanon as sectarianism. So for us, for Amel's readers, his near constant reflection on and dissection of categories and logics of analysis is bound to get tiresome. But in those moments, I would invite us to think about how much more exhausting it would have been to write what we're reading. I did a lot of this sort of thinking while translating Amel because I was writing my dissertation at the same time, and I couldn't help but think how hard it would be to write like Amel does, with constant attention to the historicity of my terms and suspicion of the validity of my questions, not my arguments, but my questions. While this sort of attention and suspicion is precisely what we try to teach in our introduction to theory courses and other such courses for undergraduates, this is not something that I think many of the canonical texts which feature in such a course practice with the level of rigor that we see in Amel's work. Our volume contains an essay by Amel on one such canonical text of Anglophone theory, namely Edward Said's Orientalism. And without getting too deep into it, I guess we can come back to this essay if you guys want in the Q&A. I want to conclude on this text because I think it shows what Amel understood to be the stakes of method in theoretical practice. While his argument in this essay is about how Said reads or misreads, in Amel's judgment, Marxist thought, it is more generally an argument about how not to read thought in general, thought and culture and intellectual production, or how to read. As many later critics have noted, Said treats Western culture and its intellectual production as kind of a monolith, right? Discussing it in terms of nation rather than class, where Orientalism is cast as a kind of inescapable facet of Western national culture, even for an iconoclastic genius like Marx. This scheme, though, that Said draws up is, of course, unacceptable on theoretical and political grounds for Amel because it not only reflects an uncritical conflation of concepts of nation and culture that should be kind of constantly interrogated, but also in its erasure of the historical class character of ideas, it negates the possibility of the emergence of an antithesis to dominant thought, which in this case is Orientalism. So the cost of this, and what Amel characterizes as conceptual laziness, is really the possibility of resistance itself, of precisely the revolutionary theory whose construction both Amel and Said, and I think us in their wake, take to be a historical necessity for the ongoing work of anti-colonial liberation.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Angela. Though Dr. Mayssoun actually did come on, we seem to have lost her again. So I think I'll just take her place and lead from here. Now we're going to move on to contributions from the two other remaining professors. It's an absolute honor and a pleasure to be introducing Dr. David McNally today, who is my teacher and my mentor here at the University of Houston. Dr. David McNally is the NEH Cullen Distinguished Professor of History and Business at the University of Houston. He's the author of 7 books and more than 60 scholarly articles and book chapters. Dr. McNally has received both the Paul Sweezy Award and the Deutscher Memorial Award in recognition of his scholarship. He teaches in areas of global history, the political economy of race and capitalism, and Atlantic history. His most recent book, published by Haymarket in 2020, is Blood and Money: War, Slavery, Finance, and Empire. David is also a long-standing activist for Palestine and a member of the Faculty for Palestine. In 2018, he addressed a session of the Middle East Studies Association on the issues of academic solidarity with Palestine. Dr. McNally, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fadi, for that generous introduction. Let me start both by commending Hicham and Angela for a really powerful, important contribution to really the whole of the socialist left. That is to say, the activist movement, and to those of us who also work in the areas of socialist and Marxist theory, of liberation theory, and emancipatory politics more generally. It's an outstanding contribution, and it's one I think that is going to be generating discussion for many years to come. Let me also thank my colleague Abdel Takriti, who, as Hicham said, is the mover and shaker behind the incredibly important AAEF, Center for Arab Studies, here in Houston. And Fadi, again, to you for the heavy lifting you did to make this session possible. Before I begin my more formal remarks, of course, I need to acknowledge the heroic resistance of the Palestinian people, particularly today in this day of uprising, global solidarity and general strike, and in the face of brutal Israeli apartheid occupation and state violence. And I want to say in a slightly personal way that for my generation, it was opposition to the war in Vietnam that became really the flashpoint for global justice that radicalized so many of us and brought us towards the socialist left. And I believe that today the struggle for liberation in Palestine occupies that role of global flashpoint for struggles for justice and human emancipation everywhere. And so it's really fitting that we are celebrating the launch of this exciting volume of writings by a giant of Arab Marxism and international socialism, Mahdi Amel. And of course, for Ahmed, social and class struggles and national liberation are inextricably linked. I want to put this text initially in a sort of wider context of what I will call the recovery and rebirth of anti-colonial Marxism. This is something that we've been seeing for some years, and I think this text and this contribution move us forward in really significant ways. Time and time again, of course, historically, large sections of the international left have failed the tests of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. Historically, arguably, the most celebrated example being European social democracy in the face of the First World War. And it's because of these failures that Frantz Fanon famously stated that the left, in its process of recovering Marxist theory, would also need to stretch Marxism. As he put it, quote, Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. Amel is involved in a very unique and sophisticated operation of stretching Marxism in the very spirit that both Hicham and Angela spoke to. Now, of course, there are important predecessors. The internationalist left that opposed the First World War. Here in particular, Lenin in his writings on the right of oppressed nations to self-determination was fundamental, as was Rosa Luxemburg and the anti-colonial thrust of her politics and of her classic 1913 text, The Accumulation of Capital. In the early years after the Russian Revolution, the Communist International organized the famous Baku Congress of the Peoples of the East in 1920. But it's fair to say that most of these traditions became precariously weak or lost over long periods of time. During the eras in which the global left was increasingly reduced to a kind of dogmatic slumber, in which, particularly under the deadening weight of the Stalin period. It was the repetition of official formulas rather than the development of rigorous, creative, historical materialist thought. During that period, many of these traditions were marginalized. And these are the traditions, of course, that in his really significant text in his announcement of resignation from the French Communist Party, Aimé Césaire tried to articulate, where after the French Communist Party had made clear its support for colonial policy in Algeria, in 1956, Césaire, who was a communist deputy from Martinique, announced his resignation, but he said, "It is neither Marxism nor communism that I am renouncing. What I want is that Marxism and communism be placed in the service of Black people." And really, that is the spirit, it seems to me, that we capture in these writings by Amel. That is to say that Marxism and communism be placed in the service of Arab people and of the anti-colonial struggle globally. This is why I think today, as we are searching for an anti-colonial and decolonial Marxism, that there has been such an important set of returns to the relationships in the 1920s and 30s between Pan-Africanism and Marxism, between Pan-Arabism and Marxism in a later period, the enormous interest throughout Latin America and beyond in the 1920 writings of Jose Carlos Mariátegui on indigenous liberation and anti-colonialism, the recuperation of C.L.R. James's writings on Pan-Africanism and the Haitian Revolution, exciting scholarship coming from India on Bengali Muslims in the origins of communism in India, and so on. These anti-colonial origins of Marxism outside of Europe and the global North predominantly are now given in this volume assembled by Hicham and Angela a huge additional boost. We have now an outstanding text of Arab Marxism available to readers in English. And in the minutes that I have remaining, I want really just to highlight three really key themes from the volume: critical method, socialist strategy, and the political economy of the colonial relation. And as Angela has already indicated, it is striking the degree to which Amel signals his radical break from the stultifying dogmatism that had dominated so much of the international left throughout the Stalin period. He tells us early on in one of the critical essays in the volume that we need to, quote, liberate our thought and make it creative. He contends that this means departing from preformed thought. Concrete analysis, in other words, must replace sterile formulas. Real active engagement with social problems and social struggles. The analysis must be rigorous and it must be grounded in the new phenomena in front of us. Secondly, socialist strategy. Because here, Amel totally turns upside down long-standing inherited formulas. In particular, the idea that in the colonial world, what needs to be first waged is an anti-feudal struggle, and that the anti-feudal struggle will occupy an entire historical epoch before socialism and anti-capitalism can be put on the agenda. Instead, he argues to us that the so-called feudal landowning class in the colonial world is in fact integrated with the mercantile bourgeoisie in the colonies and into global commodity production. That this is a landowning class which is not feudal in substance or in form. And therefore, the class struggle of the oppressed, of peasants and workers in the colonies, will be an anti-capitalist and socialist one. Indeed, he makes it clear that there is no meaningful national liberation that is not socialist in form and in content. And this, it seems to me, gives this work an enormous contemporary resonance and relevance. And finally, a few comments on the extremely rich and often experimental thinking through of colonialism and underdevelopment. As both Hicham and Angela have suggested, the set of problems that these texts raise do overlap with the dependency theorists who were based primarily in Latin America. But the thinking is often more rigorous in character. In particular, Amel is not satisfied, it seems to me, with what has been sometimes characterized as a methodological nationalism that creeps into some of the dependency theorists' thinking. That is to say, the idea that we need to analyze the global system of imperialism as a set of relations between nation states, some of whom are colonized and some of whom are colonizers. Now, of course, the colonial relation is front and center to Amel's argument. But it seems to me that he's consistently situating that colonial relation in a global social class context. He is trying to illuminate for us a very complex structural unity, and that, by the way, is a term he uses repeatedly, like this idea of a structural unity. There are specific laws of motion and relations that are happening in the economic and social system in the colonies, but these are not separate in any way from the larger laws of motion of the global capitalist economy as a whole. We're dealing with a totality, again, a term he uses a number of times, but a complexly differentiated totality, an uneven one, to use a term that he also uses at times. So the task of theory is not simply to look at nation states and delineate a relationship of dependency. He's going far beyond that and instead trying to analyze a global social totality that is fractured not only along class lines with respect to a global class structure, but also fractured along colonial lines. And it is the bringing of these levels of analysis together, which is sometimes, I think, still in a very experimental stage. You feel like you're in the laboratory of a very rich, deep, and complex thinker whose concepts are themselves in motion. They're not fixed, they're not static, they're inherently dynamic as he's probing and pushing them to see how far he can take them before further nuances need to be addressed and introduced into the analysis. And I find this incredibly powerful. Finally, he says to us there is a unitary global history that in the first instance, the colonialists brought the colonial world into that history. But now he says to us, in this era of global colonial revolt, the relationship is moving in the opposite direction. Now the revolts from the colonies are rewriting the history of world capitalism. It is not true that this is a unilinear relationship. This is a multilinear, multi-directional one. Because they are part of a complex structural unity, the revolts of the oppressed classes in the colonial world have a world transformative capacity in relationship to global capitalism as a whole. This is an enormous statement with respect to the agency of the oppressed masses of the colonial world. And it seems to me that it is an enduring contribution of Mahdi Amel's writings that have been brought to us in this volume. And I think it is a fitting one at this moment of Palestinian insurgence and global solidarity to remind ourselves of the commitment to doing a revolutionary theory in which the revolts of the anti-colonial revolts of the oppressed have a world historic capacity and significance. So I thank both Hicham and Angela for bringing this volume to us, and to all of our hosts today for making this discussion of the volume possible.
Thank you very much, Dr. David, for this. We are now going to move to the contributions from Dr. Abdel Razzaq Takriti. It's also another pleasure to be introducing my advisor, my mentor, and my colleague, the director of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies. Dr. Abdel Razzaq is also the inaugural holder of the AAEF Chair in Modern Arab History and is an associate professor at the Department of History here at the University of Houston. He holds a DPhil in history from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and is the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, which was 1965 to 1976, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2013, and then the paperback in 2016. He's also the co-author, along with Professor Karma Nabilsi, of the Digital Humanities Project, The Palestinian Revolution, which was also published virtually in 2016. Dr. Abdel Razzaq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fadi, and thank you to all of the previous speakers for illuminating different aspects of Mahdi Amel's thought. Now, I must admit, I had a slightly different presentation prepared, but given the events in Palestine, I want to talk a little bit about how the sort of thinking that Mahdi Amel produced intervenes in questions like the question of Palestine and relates to them. In reflecting on this subject, I think it's very important to historicize Mahdi Amel and to historicize Marxist thinking produced in the Arab region in particular. David has alluded to the question of dependency theory, and he spoke of it as a primarily Latin American phenomenon. Of course, that is the general impression, and to some extent it is true if we're thinking of people like Gunther Frank and so on and so forth. But when we look at the particular context of Arab Marxist thought, we find that there's at least three major theorists that have produced major strands that relate to dependency theory, even if they do not fully conform to it, as Mahdi Amel's case itself illustrates. We have Samir Amin, and in the case of Samir Amin, he is usually de-Arabized as a thinker, presented as somebody that is somehow global thinker based in Dakar, maybe even in some cases presented as a Francophone, almost a French intellectual, sometimes as an African intellectual, but actually his social context, his political context, and his Egyptian background are often, not particularly emphasized, to say the least. We have Anwar Abdul Malik, who is generally approached and within at least the Marxist circles that are dominant in the West as an area studies specialist. If you want to read about Egypt, you go read Anwar Abdul Malik, which means that a book like Egypt Military Society is highlighted at the expense of theoretical interventions like social dialectics, the 2 volumes of social dialectics, which are actually very important contributions and discussions relating to the sort of Marxism that David was referring to earlier, the Marxism that is cognizant and that centers coloniality and the colonial question. The third figure that we can think of is Mahdi Amel. And I'm talking here primarily about figures from the Mashriq. Of course, the Maghreb has a rich tradition in its own right. Now, what explains the reduction of Anwar Abdul Malik into an area studies specialist and the appropriation of someone like Samir Amin into a different into a different level of thought or a sphere of thought, and of course the total erasure of somebody like Mahdi Amel from the mainstream of Marxist thinking, at least in many parts of the Western world. I think that a lot of it has to do with the relationship between Marxism and the Arab region in particular. And it has not been an easy relationship. I think it's very important to emphasize that and to emphasize Palestine's role in determining the uneasiness of that relationship. From the earliest appearance of socialism in the region, and I'm talking here about non-communist varieties of socialism, but nevertheless forms of thought that asserted themselves as socialist, like the Saint-Simonian thinking. Some major strands of socialism appeared as colonialism. The Saint-Simonians made their appearance in the region during the reign of Muhammad Ali Pasha, and they were definitely part of the group of technocrats that determined some of the relationships that Mahdi Amel himself refers to as he investigates how the background to the colonial mode of production emerged. Okay. Then we find them intervening in Algeria, where they very much played a key role in developing the colonial system in Algeria. Later on, when more radical strands of socialism appear, and Hicham and I wrote about this recently in a piece that we're contributing to the Cambridge History of Socialism. Once we get to the era of the Second International, which is, of course, the era right after Marx, we find a situation whereby this part of the world is ignored, but also this part of the world is beginning to be subject to Zionist interest. And some of that Zionist interest seeped into Second Internationalist circles. It does not mean that it was dominant. It does not mean that it controlled the conversation. There were some very passionate critics of that way of viewing the world, and indeed of colonial strands within the International as a whole, like Rosa Luxemburg and others. And indeed, Lenin himself was involved in combating some of these colonialist ideas, including some early Zionist discussions. But in the Arab region, we find that the European left, at least, was often far more disproportionately influenced by Zionist thinking than it was by concern for the Arab world, certainly at the height of the colonial period. Arab Marxists did not like that, to say the least. They tried to combat that. And we have here a scholar who has written on this. We have Dr. Sanat Nouri Karam. Recently, she investigated some of the interventions of Arab Marxists and Arab leftists in an attempt to, confront these tendencies, especially in the era of the Third International. By the time we get to the Third International, there is the beginnings of an Arab communist movement. But we do not see as of yet a comprehensive theoretical overhaul of Marxist theory that allows it to correspond to the realities of peoples like the Arab peoples, or of questions like the question of Palestine. Mahdi Amel was very cognizant of what needs to be done because he was aware of this background. He was aware of the fact that you now had party structures that were Marxists that were fighting for freedom, but they were using theoretical tools that did not address the specificity of their universal fight for freedom. There's an interesting formulation he has in this wonderful translation where he says, you know, the specificity of universality has to be highlighted. And that specificity was missing. The way the Arab Communist parties dealt with it initially was through what we could call an emphasis on the political practice without much emphasis on the theoretical overall. And when there was an emphasis on political practice, what I mean is that also included reflections on colonial condition. It also included intellectual production, analyzing colonialism. However, it was still analyzing colonialism using tools and concepts that were not developed in the Arab context of colonialism. This led to a contradiction between political visions and political thought. We see this especially in places like the Palestine Communist Party, where cadres of the party, up until the split from the United Jewish Palestinian, Arab Palestinian Party that it existed initially, and which was set up in accordance with classical colonialist thinking. Until that split takes place, after the 36 revolt and after all the pressures of events on the ground, until that moment, there is a serious contradiction between people's anti-colonial outlook and the impoverished theoretical concepts that they were using in relation to colonialism. Mahdi Amel demolishes many of these concepts. When he talks, for example, about the question of working class colonizers and colonists, he demolishes this question because he highlights the fact that in a place like Bab el-Wad in Algiers, a working class European neighborhood, you found the staunchest resistance to anti-colonial liberation in that country. So you cannot just apply classical concepts like the proletariat without adjusting for the colonial mode of production that he is talking about and for the colonial relations that underlie these forms of class formation. You also cannot typically analyze national liberation movements in the ways that at least the Soviet Union used to classify them. Using terminology for somebody like Amel, and he notes this, the class structure in a place like the Arab region, which is colonized and dominated, in a place like Palestine, is very fluid, precisely because of the colonial relation that determines that space. So an idea like, you know, this notion that a leadership of somebody like the Mufti, for example, during the mandate period, or later on somebody like, you know, major PLO leaders at a later phase could just be reduced to a specific and clear class background needs to be revisited in line with the colonial relation. It has to be adjusted in relation to that. Many thinkers, of course, instinctively knew that. Ghassan Kanafani, for example, wrote about that in his analysis of the 36 revolt, that you need to view not just the relationship of these leaders towards the class structure in their societies, but also where they stand in relation to the colonial dominant power. Mahdi Amel was very cognizant of the need to account for that without falling into this idea of a flattening, this is a struggle of the whole nation and there is no class dimension to it. He warns against both tendencies. And I think this is very important for a place like Palestine, because part of the intellectual framework through which a country like the Soviet Union supported this, the setting up of the Israeli colonial structure in Palestine. And when I say supported, I mean they provided the guns for it through the Czech arms deal. Of course, the Western countries played the dominant role in this process. But here we're talking about Marxism, and we're talking about the problems within traditional forms of Marxism that Mahdi Amel was challenging in his analysis. Such support from the Soviet Union for a colonist project like that was predicated on the notion, on two ideas. One, that Arab Palestinian society is led by a reactionary feudal class, and that is therefore will always serve reactionary feudal interests of a country and will therefore ally with Britain by default. The second premise was that there is a revolutionary potential amongst the working classes of the colonizing populations. And the fantasy here is that somehow joint struggle between working classes will, from both the colonists and the colonized communities, will produce liberation. So this foregrounding of the class background understood through a European lens comes at the expense of an appreciation for the colonial dynamic in a place like Palestine. And of course, Mahdi Amel, if we look at his biography, we find that there's two places that had major impact on his life. One is Palestine through his life in a Lebanon that was invaded and besieged by the Israelis and that also housed the Palestinian Revolution. And the other influence is Algeria, a place that he contributed to the struggle in and that he ended up moving into. So he's very much dealing with settler colonial questions, even if he came from a country that did not necessarily experience settler colonialism, but experienced other forms of colonial domination. So Mahdi Amel was grappling with this question. He was challenging the intellectual infrastructure that allowed for this sort of travesty to take place, and that we still hear today. We still hear it from people on the left who have great hopes for the Israeli working class or the Israeli, so-called Israeli left. There is here, let me break some news to you in case you haven't heard it yet. I'm sure you've heard it from other people, but it doesn't hurt to remind. There is no such a thing as a revolutionary Israeli class at the moment, because they are embedded in the colonial relationship structurally. There are some individuals, we can count them on two hands at the moment, that are fully liberated. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it's a very small number. Ilan Papes of the world, I can't even think of anybody fully amongst intellectuals that I really trust other than Ilan, to be honest with you. Amongst Israeli intellectuals, there's a bankruptcy there. And that's structural. In the same way that in South Africa, we had the same problem amongst the white. You had a communist party, but the white members in it In the words of Ronnie Casseroles, in the 60s, when they started the struggle, you can fit all of them into a telephone booth. It was him and Joe Slavo. Okay, so I think Mahdi Amel helps us demolish some of these mythologies in relation to a place like Palestine. He also helps us to center a question like the question of Palestine in our understanding of how capitalism operates as a whole. And I think this issue that David has alluded to earlier was one of the main concerns of not just Arab Marxists, but Marxists from the Afro-Asian world in general. Because what is Marxism if it cannot account for the experience of the majority of humanity? It is not a marginal phenomenon, the colonial phenomenon. And the colonial relation is not a marginal relation. It is the dominant relation. But yet you pick up, and I'm going to end on this note, and to emphasize how important Mahdi Amel is. I do not think that an author, a historian, and I'm a historian, so I'll speak about historians. I do not think that somebody like Eric Hobsbawm would have been able to write a book of the sort he wrote had he read Mahdi Amel. Because that book erases the world in trying to claim to provide a history of the world. It provides a history of capitalism, for sure. Capitalist expansion is accorded for. Provides a history of the bourgeoisie and its aspirations in multiple volumes. But what is missing, and this is what Mahdi Amel talks about, that to just look at the equation from the perspective of capitalism and not look at it from the perspective of colonialism is to miss a major aspect of the human experience. Palestine belongs to that aspect of the human experience. Today, we are witnessing an entire people rising up from the river to the sea, a statement that colonialist Zionists have criminalized in the United States. If you say it, sometimes you lose your job, and sometimes they harass you. You're trying to erase Israel. Well, you're trying to erase Palestinians day and night. You have erased Palestinians. And yes, I come from Haifa. Other people in this room come from other places that lie between the river and the sea, and we have a right to liberate our country. Somebody like Mahdi Amel was unyielding in establishing the theoretical basis for such project of liberation, and it is only fitting that we talk about him on this day of struggle and resistance that we see unfolding in Palestine today. And thank you very much.
For those who might have joined us late, I just wanted to remind that we at the center are on strike today in solidarity with the general strike in Palestine, and we decided to proceed with this event as we felt it was necessary that Mahdi Amel and his legacy falls into the category of the rich tradition of educational programs in support with strikes. So we have a question first from Abdel Al-Akri, and then we'll go to Anna El-Sisi. So
Abdel Nabi was a leading Marxist revolutionary who played key roles in several revolutions in the region. So we're very honored to have you with us, Abdel Nabi, today.
Well, I didn't follow, I didn't follow the discussion from the beginning, but I happened to be in Lebanon, living in Lebanon when Mahdi Amel was very active in teaching and in lecturing and in discussing. And it happens also that this was during the strong presence of the Palestinian Revolution, the PLO in Lebanon, and its daily impact on Lebanese life and thinking and setup of Lebanese even society. What I want to raise the question is that, what is the impact? I mean, what is the impact of Mahdi Amel on engaging the Lebanese left, especially the communists, in contributing to the Palestinian Revolution? We know that many of them recruited within the Palestinian Revolution ranks, all, let's say, posed as a strong ally in defense of Palestinian revolution, which was at that time also exposed to attacks, political and non-political activities. This is one. On the other hand, what was the impact of Palestinian revolution on the thinking of Mahdi Amel in a way to depart from classical or what they call traditional communist theory or what you call practices to disengage away from revolutions and radical ideas?
Hi, thanks all for a brilliant discussion on this strike day in solidarity with Palestine. I don't know how to say this in English بالعربي. أنا مبسوطة إن إحنا بنفتح المواضيع بقى. بما إن إحنا بنفتح المواضيع, my question to all of you. Sorry, I also do my grocery shops on the day that I don't work, which actually takes me to my question. I mean, you've all reflected on this question of the various ways in which Marxists of the global South and of the Arab world in particular have dealt often in various forms of stagist ways in the problems of class and the problems of capitalism and the problems of colonialism, and have in various ways sort of put one before the other or developed all sorts of ways of handling these things which haven't necessarily served either them as decolonizers nor as working class people. But I'm hoping that some of you can reflect on some of the gender myopias that Marxists like myself and a historian like myself, who very much finds the kinds of sources of inspiration that you might find in Samir Amin or Mahdi Amel, but then is also in my work extremely disappointed when it comes down to it. And I if there's anyone, I'd love to hear the four of you actually reflect on this, seeing as we're getting down and really reflecting on the ways in which we've missed some of the insights of these Arab Marxists. I'd like to hear how we reconcile that.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to go ahead and read an anonymous question that was posed to me. The person says, thank you, Hicham and Angela, for your work, and thanks to the speakers and the organizers for this event. The question is, how do you think the work of Mahdi Amel does or can travel or stretch from the time he wrote to now, or from Lebanon to other contexts of dependency and state sectarianism, even from academia to the streets, where those uprisings of 2011 onwards you mentioned at the start took place?
My quick answer to it is this whole idea of liberation being in a colonial context, that of a national, not a nationalist struggle, where you cannot replace class struggle with nationalist struggle, nor can you replace a national struggle with class struggle, that actually socialist revolution in a colonial context is the severance of the colonial relationship, which liberates both, the whole world. It doesn't just liberate the colonized world. And so I think the turn that happened in the late 60s after 1967 and the outburst of the Palestinian revolution after the military defeat in 1967 was definitely a turning point in how communism, because Amel was among the young communists in the late 60s that called for a revision of how communist parties prioritized class struggle and how they ignored national liberation, which in a particular context of Amel was the liberation of Palestine from settler colonial Israel. So at least at the theoretical level, this is where I see the impact of the history of colonized Palestine. So I guess in a way I did address that, but I'm happy to have someone else talk about it. The question about the gender question, yes, that is something that Amel does not tackle. And I would treat him the way I treat Marx, the way Amel treats Marx. Amel does not invalidate the work of Marx, quite the contrary. Speaking of critical method, Amel, as a matter of fact, says that Marx contributes to our understanding of the colonial relation, because Marx talks about the colonial relation appearing as an economic dependency. And also Marx shows us that the colonial relation is what unified the world, is the historical unity of the world was actually achieved materially through imperialism, through the expansion of capitalism from Europe elsewhere. However, and this is to build on Angela's, Amel says that Marx is a product of his historical specificity, Marx, the individual, the thinker. And so he could not possibly have thought of, the colonial relation other than how the colonial relation impacts the evolution and development of capitalism. And Lenin also maybe less so. I was just saying that maybe Lenin was a bit more conscious, but at the end of the day, he applied historical materialist analysis to these thinkers. And my point on gender is we do the same, in my view, to these thinkers. They also have a blind spot, which is gender. And I also, it was a disappointment as well on my end, but that doesn't mean we cannot be inspired by their work on, questions of the colonial social reality. So it's a matter of how we criticize them. It's not about not criticizing them.
On the revolution, Abdel Nabi, you were there, so I think actually you can tell us more about the influence of the Palestinian revolution on Arab Marxist thinking in that period. Do you have any recollections? By the way, Abdel Nabi was a member of the foreign relations for the Dhofar revolution, for the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arab Gulf. He was also later on a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, and was very involved in these movements in general. So, Abdel Nabi, if we were to ask you what was the influence on Palestinian revolution on your thinking and people like Mahdi Amel around you, do you have any thoughts?
Well, of course, it has first. It was known as Dhofar Revolution. It was more Omar Revolution anyway. And when we have spontaneous, what they call back to Bahrain, it is Popular Front in Bahrain, not Liberation, just for record. Anyway, concerning the Palestinian Revolution, of course, it has a huge impact. I remember that at that time I was in the secondary school in Lebanon, and usually there are pamphlets which are distributed below the doors, when in the dormitory. So about the Palestinian Revolution, this was in early 60s, when it started. And there were discussions, muted discussions. There were discussions. I was at the American University in Beirut. At that time, it was, of course, a hub for leftists. So there was discussion among students, in the streets, and about, because some, of course, were considering that this Palestinian revolution is a national responsibility. They were looking for Nasser, what Nasser would say about that. Others were said that this is anonymous. But of course, it inspired many from left and right to change their behavior or give up something that taken for granted. Is that revolution means it has to be with the specific program, with organization. It should be. So many leftists, and I could say not only leftists, but among leftists, joined the Palestinian revolution ranks, and they volunteered to fight within the ranks of the revolution, amongst some Gulfies, some like Ahmed Rabi, for example, I say for example. And so they did it, of course, secretly in most cases, because this is a kind of defiance to the family and to the society, but it did attract volunteers from different shades of political shade. And they look at it as a beginning for the liberation, not only of Palestine, but for themselves, for their own countries. And of course, we know that many leftists, including communists, joined Fatah, for example, which was, let's say, some will brand it as rightist movement, but they took the essence of the core of the issue. The core of the issue is that you fight for the liberation of your people. And of course, this is a big mission. And then you can discuss other issues like class and so on, so on, so on. And
I think maybe what you're hinting at is something that is very important in Mahdi Amel's own thought, which is that the realities of struggle also shape theory. And I think this is a point that he constantly emphasizes. So it's the idea that theory has to emanate and has to correspond to realities of struggle. And certainly I really genuinely believe that it's very clear from his theory that it corresponded to ideas of struggle, even when it came to basic concepts, like, for example, this idea of class substitution that he talks about. For anybody that knows the history of the region's revolutionary movements, there is no way that that concept was not talking about actually and referring to Nasser in particular, and to Nasser's trajectory in relation to the liberation of the region, but also Palestine, because Mahdi Amel talks about this idea of the petty bourgeoisie trying to universalize itself as the class that sets the bar, let's say, for liberation, and that wants to spread itself as a class of everybody. Okay, that form of thinking in relation to Palestine, but also in relation to the broader Arab liberation project as a whole, clearly is influenced by engagements with something like the Nasserist project. And there are some references actually specifically to Egypt, but also Algeria, when he's talking about these kinds of ways of thinking. And we know very well that after 1967, this critique of the petty bourgeois character of revolutionary leaderships became very common in this period.
Just to point on the petty bourgeois, I think this is a good way to think of class in a colonial setting. He says the petty bourgeois is the center of history. So it's not just a critique of the petty bourgeois, it's the idea that in a structurally dependent social formation, the petty bourgeois become the center of history, and then you can move on and actually critique it. But this is the idea of studying it, because actually the struggle in a colonial setting for liberation is not against a class. That's another feature of the colonial mode of production. Which makes it more difficult, because you don't have a class in front of you that you're fighting. Actually, the fight of liberation itself is the fight to form a working class itself, because of the limits of the colonial mode of production. And this probably brings us to the third question about, and please somebody feel free to step in if I jumped in, but the last question about how can Mahdi Amel's work be relevant today? Because Mahdi is very, very weary of appearances and self-evident truths. And one of the things he constantly fights against is the idea that colonialism ends when you have the end of military presence or when you have political independence. And this complicated, multi-layered structural unity that David referred to exists very much after the formal independence of these countries, which is also a critique that Abed was saying about the limits of the petty bourgeois project. So my point is today, it is much more difficult today for the generations of today to think of their context as potentially neo-colonial or colonial without the memory, the direct memory of what colonialism is. And what Amel gives us is a theoretical tool that allows us to still see our reality as a colonial reality without necessarily having all the appearances of what a colonial reality is, which I find is not as easy today to argue. Maybe it's easier after the invasion of Iraq, but my point is that this is what Amel can help us with. Methodologically speaking, we have neo-colonialism by Nkrumah, we have the colonial mode of production by Amel. So all these theoretical tools, maybe we can rethink them and rework them to apply to today's reality.
And of course, when it comes to neo-colonialism, Amel has a critique of the concept because he says it actually does not correspond to the reality of the colonial mode of production. Colonialism does not end with the departure of troops, because actually the colonial relation is the colonial is the dominant form, and it's not a relation that could be reduced to just military occupation, although he highlights.
And even he goes further and actually critiques decolonization, Fanon's interpretation, because he says, again, it's a passive way. He's very opposed to the idea of retrieving authentic thought, and he really pushes for the idea of liberation rather than decolonization. Sometimes it can sound semantic, but I think that is important, especially that we have so much conversation today about what decolonization is.
Angela, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah.
But also, we have also a second question from Dr. El-Sisi that has not been addressed. So maybe Angela or David can.
Sure. I actually, okay, I lost, I couldn't hear for quite a bit. And I thought Dr. Sisi said something totally different. I didn't think she said gender myopia. I thought she said agenda myopia, and was talking about, she mentioned how we miss the insights of Arab Marxists and don't bring them up in our work. And I thought she was talking more about, like, in general, how our agendas as scholars, even if we're engaged in Marxist theory, and even if we read Arabic, tend not to engage with the theory of Mahdi Amel or other Marxists who wrote in Arabic, right? So I actually wanted to speak to that, and I think it also bears on the third question, which is how does Amel stretch? And I think we've talked a lot about how he helps us understand, conflicts and problems and contexts that are relevant today. Like it is a very, in my opinion, it's very applicable, like Marxist theory to liberation struggles, so kind of whatever we want to talk about across the board. But I want to bring it back to this agenda myopia question, which even if I misheard it, I want to address it because it's something that I dealt with that was like a bane of my existence in graduate school, right? Which is, and especially this is coming from I'm an intellectual historian, and the intellectual history is basically modern intellectual history is basically a field dominated by European intellectual history, right? And the only way we can kind of bring in discussions of other traditions into the room is kind of by relating it, to whatever European thinkers are saying. And meanwhile, the kind of very valuable insights of thinkers, of Arab thinkers, not even those who write in French and English, are just kind of not present in the discussion. And so on that, I kind of want to go back to this comment that Hicham made earlier about how, Amel really does emphasize that Marx is a kind of a product of his time, right? But at the same time, he does not at all, that Marx is a text that he reads with a kind of not at all, it's not a kind of basic kind of contextualism, or that reduces Marxian thought to its context, right? He really takes it seriously. He looks for, it's like gaps in Marxian thought that then become like rabbit holes to completely other topics. And it's really it's a valuable understanding, in my opinion. It's a valuable paradigm for how to engage with text as an intellectual historian, because as intellectual historians are aware, like this problem of contextualism, of the inability of ideas to kind of transcend their context and mean in conversations today. This is like the perpetual methodological debate among intellectual historians. And I think Amel really gives us a nice paradigm. Adorno talks about this. There's Adorno, kind of resists this idea that then he frames it as a Hegelian idea that we really can kind of reduce ideas to the context in which they came. There's a principle of movement in these ideas as well that's recoverable, right? Peter Gordon calls it the aspirational content of ideas, and it's content that kind of moves above the content of arguments that move above the situations in reaction to which, or in engagement with which they emerged in their times. So I think, and I really meant this, that's why I talked about method in my comments. Like, I think Mahdi Amel is a serious methodologist that, people not even kind of working in Marxian theory really have to learn a lot from.
Maybe others will pick this up. It was just to say that, this question of class, nation, and how the two meet has definitely been stretched in opposite directions, as those historians of the Egyptian communist movement versus, say, the Sudanese or the Palestinian can show. But my question was about how you all thought we can extract anything that is remotely useful as regards gender struggles and gender oppression in our parts of the world today from these authors, including Mahdi Amel. And in my experience, you know, these are my subjects, my comrades, but also it's been quite frustrating. And you know, my writing, I think, yeah, it's been a tough one. So that's what I was hoping you could all reflect on. But I know that lots of other people have questions and comments, so I'm happy to pick this up at a later time or even later on if people are staying up late. But thank you all for a great discussion. I'm glad to be listening to all of you today. It's uplifting in times like these to still be able to have discussions like this.
I'll just make a quick comment in relation to that, which is I think that there is an emerging literature that accounts for your question, Dr. Sisi, and I'm really glad that we have Dr. Karam, Senator Nouri Karam, that I mentioned earlier, because she writes about that, some of the problems relating to that within the Lebanese Communist Party. We also had earlier Dr. Malik Abisab, who also addressed this issue, both of them, of course, in the mandate period. I do think that in Mahdi Amel's period, there was a slightly different set of circumstances, and there were a stronger presence of women cadres who did theorize these questions, but maybe were not fully engaged with in the theoretical literature by these men that we spoke about. I mean, I don't know, maybe Angela or Hicham can know more about this, but as far as I know, it was not necessarily centered in the theoretical work. The gender question was not centered in the theoretical work of Amel and other major Marxist theorists in this period.
I think it was absent.
Angela, or
just to be, yeah, Angela, if you have another idea. Methodologically, maybe we can, but I think it was absent. That's just the reality, the unfortunate reality, but that was the case. To many extent, it was also absent in most Marxist thinkers, you know, just in Arab countries. I mean, that's deficiency and that's being handled. But sorry, Angela, if you want to say something.
No, I was going to say the same thing. It's absent in Marxist thinking, I think, of the period. Like, I don't. Yeah.
I mean, I actually had, while doing the Palestinian Revolution Oral History Project, I had the honor of talking extensively with Mayssoun about this specific question. We had many hours of conversation about it. And she was, of course, the Secretary General of the General Union of Palestinian Women at the time, and a leading revolutionary. And, you know, she spoke very strongly about the efforts of women to open pathways in their revolutionary organizations at the time. But to give a sense...
Sorry, Abed, I think referring to Amel's work, just to be clear.
Yeah, of course,
we're not saying that they weren't women.
In relation
which is the question here in this case, yeah.
But I do think that the work of Amel and others has to do also with the parties to which they belonged and the settings in which they operated. And it was a big challenge for women to fight in that setting, but they did achieve major, I think, openings. I mean, to give one example, in the Palestinian Revolution, in Fatah, initially when they set up the women's Tanzim in Fatah, it was under the responsibility of a man. He was overseeing it. And people like May and others had to wage a revolt against that. So it was always an uphill battle, but they were able to achieve that. And then they were able to create many spaces, you know, but again, the theorists like Amel and others, I believe, did not center this question adequately. But maybe, David, this corresponds to global Marxist. Was it a global Marxist problem of the time?
Look, I think it is a global problem. And I'll just really offer two comments because I know there's a lot of important discussions still to happen. But as both Hicham and Angela have emphasized, a central claim that Amel makes is that Marx himself is a product of a particular historical period. You can't be a historical materialist and imagine that people are independent of their historical context. But Marxism is capable of continuing growth and development beyond the limits of Marx as a finite person in a specific historical circumstance. And he has this beautiful formulation where he says self-critique constitutes the momentum of Marxism's development and vitality. And one of the things I think we've seen throughout the international left is a self-critique over gender, over race, over sexuality, over colonialism, over the environment. And the question is, can we develop new resources and new analyses? And so just to give one example, because it's part of the work in which I'm more engaged, there is really interesting work being done right now to essentially rewrite the propositions of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism with gender in mind. Because Cedric Robinson addresses the Black radical tradition with 3 male intellectuals and political activists. And essentially a whole range of people today are saying, what if instead of those 3 people, we rewrote Black Marxism and the Black radical tradition via Claudia Jones, Angela Davis, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore? What would it start to look like? So I think, I don't see it in the limited reading that I have done from Amel, but I think the idea of a critical Marxism capable of self-development by criticizing its own state of being creates those openings in the same way in which people today are now reopening the question, say, of Black Marxism and the Black radical tradition to fully and centrally ground gender.
Before we move to our next set of questions, Dr. Sanata Nouri Karam, who've actually mentioned multiple times during this talk, has asked if she can add something. So with your permission, I'm going to unmute her. And Dr. Sana, it's lovely to see you with us today. You should be able to speak.
Thank you so much, Fadi, and thank you everyone for this amazing discussion. I just wanted to add something on the gender issue, and it's in line with everything that's been said. I mean, I can only talk about the earlier period because I work on the interwar period. To say that women leftists who were active during that period actually linked, as Hicham is saying, the issue of class with the colonial issue and with feminist emancipation and with women's emancipation. And although a lot of them did get disappointed by the very mainstream, if we want to say, Marxist interpretations at the time, which did not account for women, which also prioritized the class struggle and also the anti-colonial struggle at the expense of women's emancipation, right? But they did understand, and they used claim making as an anti-colonial claim making to say that when we're talking about democracy, when we're talking about independence, when we're talking about anti-colonial liberation, that not giving women the vote, for instance, not allowing women to be part of the public sphere is also problematic in that sense. And that's why I think, as Hicham has mentioned, and as David was saying, that to be able to think of gender in relation to the colonial question and to class is the answer to this. And I think methodologically, as Angela was saying, Mahdi Amel offers that to us, to be able to think of these various complex issues together rather than separate. I think that is the answer that Mahdi Amel would give. And I think that a lot of feminist leftists have given us as well.
Thank you so much for joining us, Nate. He's the Ibrahim Abul Fellow at the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Fadi. Thank you for organizing this great talk at the Arab Studies Center. Thank Hicham and Angela for their great work. We've discussed a lot the context of the Palestinian revolution, especially relevant for today, and my salute to the great strike of the Palestinian people going out right now. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the direct conditions of Mahdi Amel's intellectual production, especially during the era of the protracted civil war, international civil war in Lebanon, really, and how the condition, how that affect, what, if you could speak a little bit more about the conditions of his work, how living in a time of extreme social, political fragmentation, where the country is literally divided into areas controlled by different, and neighborhoods controlled by different militias, different foreign occupying powers. There's extreme external intervention. The problem of hegemony, or creating a sort of national popular common sense, is a really tough one in, well, the Mashriq as a whole, but especially in Lebanon. So I was wondering if you could comment on how the conditions of civil war shaped much of his work, and speak about his relation to the party, to the Communist Party, Lebanese Communist Party, and the popular movements of the time, because his commitment was really quite extraordinary, how long he held on to it after a series of defeats, and many other left-wing intellectuals and movements and forces had given up the ghost. So I think that's one extraordinary thing about Amel, that how the durability of his commitment all the way to the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. And now the next question had come from Dr. Jens Hansen, who is also another dear friend of the center. He's also a co-editor with not just one of our speakers in this panel today with Hicham, with the Clarion of Syria, but he's also co-editor of Dr. Abdel Razzaq, who has been with us multiple times before. So Dr. Jens, you should be able to speak now.
Good evening.
Hi, Jens.
Hello. Hello, good to see everybody. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Hicham. Good to see everybody. Yeah, big up for hosting this on the day of the Palestinian general and global strike. I appreciate that you went ahead, not in spite of, but because of this strike, because it contributes to spread the word. I know it's never an easy decision, but I think this is the right thing to do. I'm also excited, of course, about this incredible book translation project. It's on my reading list for my next Arab intellectuals class, of which Professor Abdel Razzaq Takriti was the first student class. And in particular, the question of method and theory that Angela talked about. We've talked about this before, and not something that we can solve now. What I'm interested in, perhaps in separate discussions with members of this audience, is I think what's exciting about Mahdi Amel is he inserts the colonial question, but does not, unlike a certain Saidian trend, leave it at the epistemological level. So here's an opening with Mahdi Amel, a kind of a foundational moment, although of course there are always people before the first, where, and for us, I guess, to try and think materially, or to rethink materialism, not even perhaps, David, in terms of historical materialism, not perhaps just in dialectical materialism terms, but in somehow a sort of colonial materialism, somehow a frame that is both discursive, that is epistemological, but that is deeply grounded in the economy of things, in the political economy of things. Because it seems to me that Mahdi Amel, or going back to Mahdi Amel's texts, is precisely the ground on which we can, in some ways, be both Saidian and Marxist. We can be both political economists or international political economists and critics of colonial regimes of knowledge production. That's sort of my, I guess not a question, but sort of an orientation that I have taken from your work and from this wonderful discussion. Thank you.
All right, so with that, I'll read the next two set of questions. So the next one's from Adil Mohsen. Thank you so much, Adil, for joining us today. He thanks the speakers speakers today, and especially with the ongoing strike. He was wondering if you think Amel failed to account for the unfortunately very concrete reality of sectarianism in Lebanon, and that his Marxist analysis of Lebanese society was far too armchair and utopian than what things were on the ground, and they have turned out until today. Ultimately, he was murdered by his co-confessionalists in their attempt to homogenize their sect and radicalize it under sectarian ideology. And the next question is an anonymous one. Also, thanks the panelists for fascinating discussion. This person would like to know how Mahdi Amel viewed the popular mobilization led by the Iranian Lebanese Shia cleric Musa Sadr, particularly since the creation of the movement of the deprived in 1974 and the Amal movement in 1975. Secondly, it seems that the first Shia movement emerging in Lebanon, Amal and then Hezbollah, were also really influenced by the Palestinian revolution, ideologically, socially, politically, etc. Could you reflect on your thoughts on this?
I think you should go ahead and reflect on the civil war, Hicham.
Okay, well, let me then very quickly.
By Ahmed that we didn't get a chance to discuss, which is
right
discussion,
which links to Nate's question. You know, Amel was criticized for remaining in the Communist Party, and he was seen by some as being, and this also links to the last question about being abstract, up in the air, out of touch with the trajectory of the civil war in the mid-80s. And he was persistently opposed to that. And actually he thought that was very much coming out of a sectarian interpretation of the war, which also links to the question about Amal and Hezbollah. So you can read his, if you're interested more about the conditions that he lived through, both in Lebanon and also in Algeria and France, the book by his wife, the late Abdul Hamdan, will have a lot more on his life, which I can't speak as much on. And somebody actually shared the cover of the book in the chat, so you can go ahead and check that. If that's what you're referring to as the conditions. If you think of the conditions of the civil war itself, Amel actually was adamant that we cannot ignore the class dimension of the war, even when the ideology and the expression of the conflict was sectarian. So I can't speak on his what he thought of Musa Sadr individually, but after 82, Amel insisted that those who were opposing the Bashir Gemayel project were actually a revolutionary. They were revolutionary. However, they had the potential of being reactionary because of the ideology. So he did say that their objective position in the struggle within the civil war was one opposed to the reactionary forces of the Kata'ib and the project, the sectarian project, the fascist version of the sectarian system that was trying to save the sectarian system. And he said it can go both ways. Either this movement that has sectarian tendencies in its consciousness will realize this reactionary aspect of its consciousness and will reject it and will actually be fully revolutionary and create an anti-sectarian system, socialist secular system, or these tendencies will persist and we may end up, instead of a Maronite sectarian hegemony, we may have a Sunni hegemony or a Shia hegemony, which is not a resolution to the struggle in Lebanon, but a reproduction of the sectarian system. So I would argue actually, and I will actually build this a little bit quickly, if you allow me, to today's world. Today's situation in Lebanon, because you might say he's not relevant, he's an armchair. He was always saying, I'm not a historian, I'm a theoretician. You know, I recognize that there are historical specificities. I use history to articulate theory, which is what all historical philosophers do, and they all have shortcomings. But you know, he cannot do everything. He cannot, you know, do everything. So the point is, he actually articulated the concept of sectarian hegemony. And he said that this idea of power sharing or political participation is a myth. It is used by the non-hegemonic factions in Lebanon. At the time, they were the non-Maronite, to basically get a piece of the pie. And when this sectarian hegemony, so this idea of participation is an illusion. And what we see in today Lebanon, I argue about this in an article I wrote recently about sectarianism, hegemony, and colonialism. What we are seeing is, with the absence of a hegemon, you always have a disintegration of the central state. You have a fascist solution coming up. You have stateless arising. And so in many ways, actually, Amel's idea of a sectarian hegemony is applicable, in my opinion, today. And the last point I want to raise, sorry if I spoke too much, is his intellectual conflict with Fawaz Trabulsi over the ontological nature of sectarianism. Amel insisted all the time that sectarianism is a political relation of domination. He did not dismiss that sectarianism existed before 1860, but he said that was a sociological formation that we cannot identify completely with a post-capitalist sectarianism. So again, capitalism, imperialism, the introduction of capitalism into the Ottoman world was a rupture, a moment of rupture for Amel, a moment of formation of a new social structure, the colonial relation in its new forms. And that's how he interpreted sectarianism and the others. And to the point about, that Jens brings about historical materialism, I would argue that, I mean, this is again a point of, I think he was very much, he always wanted to argue that when he criticized Marx, it was within historical materialism. So I don't think he was clearly trying to create these dynamics, these theoretical dynamics within historical materialist understandings. There's always tension. He wasn't an economistic approach. Economism, he opposed it. So I would say that he did not see, maybe we can see him today like that, but and his critique of Said, again, like Angela wonderfully said, it was about this idea of thought as monolithic, as Western, and also the idea of centering Goethe in Marx instead of centering Marx, not Goethe. So I do still see him very much a historical materialist, but in the broadest sense, let's say, in the broadest, most generous interpretation of what historical materialism is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to build on, I kind of want to come back to the sectarianism topic first, and then we can move to, I want to go back to the question of how that Jens brings up about how, Ahmed takes us past the epistemological level of like decolonization, right? And this whole discussion that's going on in decolonial theory right now. But first, I think I'm a little confused by the question from Ade. From my perspective, even in the excerpt of On the Sectarian State that we included, I mean, Ahmed kind of talks us through the destruction, the self-destruction, the imminent self-destruction of the sectarian state, right? Like Hicham was saying, and this, I guess, it's the kind of, if we think about what Nate brought up, that he's writing in this time of extreme fragmentation, where sectarianism is going to be like the dominant framework through which everybody is thinking the problems that are at hand. I mean, it's a pretty radical thing to say that, what you think is a sect is not, and sectarianism is this completely other form of relation, this completely other kind of relation. He writes about it like with a kind of like, I don't know, a very clearly, very like, scientifically. And it's kind of remarkable to think about him doing that in this extreme context. And, when somebody writes your solution, this idea of participation is an illusion. I mean, it's not surprising that, somebody like this would be targeted. So anyway, that's the sectarianism question. I think it's very interesting. And if we want to come back to it, we can, but to go to Jens's point, and I'm glad you bring it up, because, through this whole kind of rise of decolonial theory thing, it's like Amel doesn't let us forget about political economy. And I think one of the most interesting things he does and compelling things is that, like, it's like the discussion of what we might call like epistemological decolonization or this thing and political economy, like he can't have them separately. Like I tried to, sometimes you try to map the text and like they're not even it's difficult to parse them, right? It's like what I think, you know, rightly, like critics of kind of the epistemological iteration of decolonial theory, like are, you know, say things like, you know, you're forgetting about political economy. I mean, I think it's interesting to go back to Ahmed, for whom this is not something that can be separated. These are two topics that cannot be separated. So, you know, it would be interesting to write. Jens, you should write about this or talk about this in your Arab intellectuals class or something, or have somebody write a term paper about this, because it's a very interesting point.
On a slightly critical note of Amel, since the question of Abdel Said has been raised a couple of times, I do think that he has a total misreading of what Orientalism was trying to do, even though I agree with Angela that he is talking about, you know, writing texts, but he is also trying to box Said and misrepresent his project, because what he's taking offense to is, or what he uses as an example is Marx. Okay, he says Said wants to say that every Westerner is stuck in Orientalism, and that's actually not true, because Said says that a humanist knowledge is possible, and he even cites a couple of examples. I think he was wrong on them. He cites Maxime Rodinson and he cites Roger Owen, and I think both are Orientalists in their own respective ways. But you know, they were better than what was available at the time, so that's the best you could find. So I think he went out of his way to kind of offer examples, and in both cases there were individuals who were influenced by Marxism. I mean, Rodinson was a Marxist theorist, and Roger Owen, although not a Marxist, but he used some Marxist methodologies. So I think that the issue at hand here is whether discourse analysis was acceptable for a Marxist like Amel. I do think that had he engaged with the sort of Marxist literary theory that, let's say, someone like Raymond Williams was working on, and had broken away completely from the whole idea of base superstructure, maybe he would have been a bit more generous to a project like Orientalism. Because
let me respond quickly, play the devil's advocate.
Just to create a bit of a
no, I mean, I was going to say, there's too much niceties in a lot of these book reviews, generally the debates going on. We should disagree. We should, you know, there's always everybody's trying to be nice and bash the book if you don't like it. And if you like it, praise it. And critique is, we go back to the question of self-critique as the basis of knowledge, as the basis of the production of new knowledge. But, and I think the point about epistemological break and political economy is also very important, by the way. But, and I have my own critiques of Amel as well. But the point about, let's be precise about what Amel does with Edward Said, because he doesn't talk about Orientalism as a project. And I think he even at some point validates this is a valuable project being done. But first of all, he says that Said, first of all, doesn't even, okay, so he first understands thought as the product of individual thinking. So he thinks possibly that some individuals may escape this Western paradigm, the epistemology of Western thought. And when Said thinks of them as escaping it, that's Amel's critique. He does so from the point of some humanism, some form of empathy, and not from the point of view of epistemological break because of the materiality of thought. So he says that Amel recognizes the universality of Marx only insofar as Marx can empathize with the suffering of Indians. And he actually takes Marx's point, which is not only Amel, everybody, you know, many Marxists do that. He takes Marx's point of saying, in point of history, the British are unconsciously unraveling revolution in India to mean some form of agency on the side of the British, which Amel says Marx does not try to do. And with Massignon as well. So Amel's point is Said does not identify or recognize the novelty of the materiality of Marxist thought and does not see it as outside, structurally speaking, Western thought, and not simply the kind of occasional individual break that these geniuses, exercise when they think. So Amel is making a much broader critique of this idea of Orientalism, but also maybe he commits a similar error by not reading all of Said, and he picks a certain paragraph and he says, I'm only going to discuss this. When ironically, his critique of Said is that Said actually only takes a paragraph from Marx and does this. So at a one level, maybe Amel did not do his homework, so to speak, and read extensively all of Said before speaking about Said. He commits a similar error as Said. But to be fair, his point about the humanism, again, the title of his critique is the mind the reason to the هل العقل للغرب والقلب للشرق. Is reason only dominant reason in the West is the only form of thought. And when we talk about the East, there's only one way to understand the East by Westerners, and that's through emotion, through humanism. And Amel is saying, no, people like Marx can also speak about and understand India in a novel way compared to Hegel or others because of the materiality of their thought. It is that
I agree with you.
Sorry.
I understand what you're saying, but what I was trying to say, and I want to clarify this, if we were going to go into specifics, but maybe there isn't much time to do that, and maybe we have other questions.
Yeah.
To talk about. But I do believe that there is an Althusserian limitation to how Amel deals with thought. There is this emphasis on anything bordering on humanism is a form of idealism. And in that specific review that you're talking about, the discussion of Mayssoun and the discussion of Marx, I agree with you that you described it very well, that there is this, that Said presents a struggle between their heart and their mind. The heart is for these oppressed peoples, but the mind is for, Western rationality and so on. I understand that. But the problem here is that there's no accounting for this notion that Orientalism at its core is a system of anti-humanism. It is against the humanity of the colonized person. And that there is a problem in Marxism itself on that front that Said was trying to deal with and grapple with, which is why he went straight for the head. He was like, as you know, Said was like, in that way, a bit iconoclastic when it came to these questions. He's like, I'm not gonna avoid saying Marx had a problem with this, okay? And I think he actually intentionally put him out there as a kind of attack on all the Marxists around him. That
Amel complains that he's nicer to Massimo than Marx, but anyways,
but that's not true. That's actually not true. He actually says even someone, if you go back to Orientalism, even someone with kind of like Marx's radicalism and so on.
Sure.
And I don't think he likes Massimo at all, actually. I mean, I think Mahdi Amel misreads him here.
Possibly.
There's a major attack on Massimo. But anyways, I mean, let's not turn it into Said and Amel. I just think it is a conversation that also needs to happen methodologically within the Arab left, I think, as we grapple with the question of Orientalism and with anti-colonial thought and so-called decolonial thought at the moment, which I do not subscribe to. I subscribe to anti-colonial thought. I think that Mahdi Amel would also appreciate that more, as you said, Sham. And in fact, in Arabic, we don't have a word for decolonization. We call it liberation, tahrir. So, yeah.
I mean, just real quick, I want to just because it'll irritate me. The critique when Ahmed critiques Said's humanism, he's using humanism like in the philosophical sense, as in like that Said is basically treating history as though human agency is what compels this history, right? As opposed to these larger structural forces that Amel's bringing our attention to, right? And in this respect, Amel is more in league with Althusser and the kind of, you know, non-humanist, anti-humanist turn that's happening in Marxism at this time, kind of with Althusser, right? So, and I don't think, yeah, I think that's when he talks about humanism, that's where he's going there. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, and he equates it, and you know this better than me, Angela, because you know the text probably better than most people in the world, having had to think of it for so long. But I believe there's also an equation of humanism with idealism here. And
right.
Idealism in the pejorative sense, not in...
Right, for sure. He does. That's ambiguous. Yeah. Yeah,
which obviously, you know, it is a specific Althusserian variant of Marxism that I think a lot of Marxists that do take humanism more seriously in, you know, into Marxist thought would not necessarily approve of, but I don't know. David, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. So just one thought on that, and I love the fact, by the way, that we're letting some of the debates among panelists take off at the end. Of course, we're probably exhausting our audience's patience, but look, I think there's lots to critically inspect. Amel himself has a particular formative moment, and in the communist movement in France, Althusser seems to represent for so many people the break with the old dogmatism. I think it's a flawed break. And I think it produces, for example, you know, just complete misreading of Hegel, for instance, that he engages in. So that these are really, you know, really interesting questions for further exploration. Personally, I find the analysis of the colonial relation much stronger than the analysis of the colonial mode of production. And I would love to explore it. I see tensions there, which is why I said earlier that you're in the laboratory with Ahmed. He's thinking it through and he's struggling to reformulate. And that's what makes it so exciting in all kinds of ways. And one thought on the issue of sectarianism, Hicham did post his own article on sectarianism and hegemony. I want people to go into the chat and look at it. It's a very important contribution because essentially it's a way of thinking about sectarianism that does not begin with ethnic identity, but rather with a crisis of political hegemony. And sectarianism as a direct product of a crisis of hegemony. It's a tremendously potent way of thinking this through in terms of social formations rather than ethnicities. And so I really want to push that article. And really the final point, which just is to say again, that Hicham and Angela have brought us a treasure here. And we need now to do the job when people are talking about anti-colonial Marxism, that we push them. If it's Jose Carlos Mariátegui, if it's CLR James, we have to say yes, and Mahdi Amel, that this volume and his work need to be part of this conversation about the stretching of Marxism that is essential for the revolutionary anti-colonial project of our era.
Thank you very much, David. I think that's a good point to end that. I think it's good to remind everybody that this is, in fact, the anniversary of Mahdi Amel's assassination. He was assassinated on this very day. It is also a day of strike and resistance and struggle in Palestine amidst all this colonial horror. So I hope that everybody will take this opportunity to reflect on colonialism in general, on Palestine in Palestine in particular, and also to think of ways to organize to overthrow it, which was ultimately the objective of Mahdi Amel and other radical thinkers of his ilk. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you to Fadi for running the discussion so effectively.
Thank you,
love having you around, Fadi. You're brilliant. And thank you to all our panelists and our wonderful contributors to today's discussion. And have a wonderful evening. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you for all who stayed along as well this long. Yalla. Tasbah ala khair. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.